My father lifted his champagne flute at the head of the table, and his voice carried across the entire ballroom. 40 years of marriage, he said, and tonight we celebrate the woman who gave me everything. He turned to my mother. Then his eyes traveled to my younger sister, who was beaming beside him in a cream silk dress. And tonight, he continued, we also celebrate the next chapter. The grandchild we've been waiting for. I was standing near the back of the room, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching my father raise that toast to a baby that didn't exist yet. My sister was 4 months pregnant. 4 months. Meanwhile, my own daughter, his actual first grandchild, had just turned 10 months old that morning. She was at home with my husband, sleeping in her crib, in a pair of pajamas covered in tiny embroidered bumblebees that I had picked out myself. My father had never met her. Let me back up, because I know how this sounds. I know what you're thinking. How does a man not know he has a granddaughter? How does that happen in a family in this century with phones and email and social media? I asked myself those same questions for a long time, and the answer, when I finally pieced it together, was uglier than I ever imagined. My name is Tessa. I'm 31 years old. I work as a structural engineer for a firm that designs hospitals, and for the last 6 years I'd lived in Portland, Oregon, almost 3,000 miles away from where I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. My family is what people in our town politely call old money, which mostly means my father owns half the commercial real estate downtown, and my mother sits on every charity board worth sitting on. My younger sister Bryony, 4 years younger than me, never left. She married a banker named Pierce when she was 23 and moved into a house 6 minutes from our parents. I always knew I was the less favored daughter. That's not me being dramatic. It's just a fact, like saying I have brown hair or my left eye is slightly weaker than my right. Bryony was the pretty one, the charming one, the one who could walk into a room and make everyone laugh. I was the quiet one, the one who liked math, the one who would rather read in the corner than dance at cotillion. My father used to call us his book and his butterfly. He said it like it was a compliment to both of us. It wasn't. I moved to Portland for graduate school and never came back. I told myself it was about the job market, about wanting to work on West Coast seismic projects, about the rain. The truth is, I just wanted to breathe air that didn't have my mother's perfume in it. I met my husband Holden in my 2nd year. He's a pediatric nurse, the kindest man I have ever known in my life, and he proposed to me on a hiking trail 2 years later with a ring his grandmother had left him. We got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard in the Columbia Gorge. 22 people came. None of them were from my family. That's important. I want you to understand. My family was invited. My mother RSVP'd, no, the same week she RSVP'd, yes, to a society fundraiser in Savannah. My father said he had a closing, he couldn't move. Bryony sent a Tiffany vase and a card that said, "Wish we could be there." I cried in the bathroom of the venue 20 minutes before walking down the aisle, and then I dried my face and married the man I loved, and I told myself I was done. Except I wasn't done, because 2.5 years later I got pregnant. I want to be honest about something. The pregnancy changed me. I had spent years hardening myself against my family, building this thick callus around the part of me that still wanted them to love me, and the moment I saw that second pink line, the callus cracked. I called my mother before I called anyone else except Holden. I was crying. I told her I was 12 weeks along, that we had waited to share until we got past the first trimester, that the doctor said everything looked perfect. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful. Let me tell your father." I asked if I could tell him myself. She said he was at the office and she didn't want me to interrupt his afternoon. She would handle it. She would tell him at dinner and have him call me back. He didn't call me back. I waited 2 days, then I called the office directly. The receptionist, a woman named Delia who had worked for my father since I was in middle school, told me he was in a meeting. I left my name. He didn't call back. I called again the next week. Same thing. By the time I was 16 weeks along, I had called 11 times and never gotten through. My mother kept telling me he was busy, he was traveling, he was stressed about a deal. He was happy for me, but you know how your father is. I should have flown home. I know that now. I should have gotten on a plane and walked into his office and put my hand on my belly and made him look at me. But I was newly pregnant, and morning sickness had turned into all-day sickness, and my OB had flagged some early concerns about my blood pressure, and I was told not to fly until my second trimester was further along. So I waited. I emailed him. I sent him an ultrasound photo with a long letter. I never got a response. My mother told me he had cried when he saw the picture. She told me he was overwhelmed, that he had always been like this, that men of his generation didn't know how to express their feelings about babies. She told me to give him time. I gave him time. By the time my daughter was born, I had stopped trying. Holden's parents flew out for the birth. They held her in the hospital room and cried, and his mother whispered to her in this soft voice that I will remember until the day I die. And I lay there in the bed thinking that this was what grandparents were supposed to be. We named her Jania after Holden's grandmother who had given us the ring. I sent the announcement anyway. I had ordered 100 of them, embossed cream cards with her name and birth date, and a little watercolor of a pear branch, because pear blossoms had been blooming outside the hospital window when I gave birth. I addressed one to my parents. I addressed one to Bryony and Perce. I sent a photo book of the first month of her life to my father's office, the kind of leather-bound thing he likes, with a note that said, "For your office, so you can see her every day until you meet her." I never heard a word. For 10 months, I told myself my father was processing, that he was ashamed of how he had handled the pregnancy and didn't know how to make it right. I told myself my mother was running interference for him out of love. I told myself Bryony was caught in the middle. I sent a Christmas card with Junia in a red velvet dress. I sent an Easter photo of her holding a stuffed bunny. I sent her 6-month milestone photos. I called my mother every other Sunday, and every time I asked about my father, she said he was doing well. He sent his love, he was just busy. And then, at the end of August, my mother called me. She told me my father was turning 66 in October and that she and Bryony were throwing him a combination birthday and 40th anniversary gala at the country club. She wanted me to come. She told me it would mean the world to him. She told me Bryony had a special announcement she wanted to make at the party, and that the whole family being there would make it perfect. I asked if she meant Bryony was pregnant. There was a pause, and then my mother said in this strange, bright voice, "I'm not supposed to spoil it, but yes, we're so excited, the first grandchild. The first grandchild." I sat down on the floor of my kitchen. Holden was at work. Junia was in her high chair throwing Cheerios at the dog. I sat on the floor and looked at her, this small person with her father's eyes and a little patch of dark hair sticking up from the back of her head, and I thought about the words my mother had just said, the first grandchild, and something in me that had been bending for a year finally broke. I didn't say anything to my mother. I told her I would come. I told her I'd bring a gift. I told her I was looking forward to it. Then I hung up the phone and I called Bryony. My sister picked up on the second ring, sounding sunny and distracted. "Hey, honey," she said in the syrupy tone she uses for people she's trying to manage. I asked her if Mom had told her she'd invited me. "Of course," Bryony said. "Of course you should be there." Then I asked her, point blank, what announcement she was planning to make. She laughed. She said it was a surprise. She said I would love it. I said, "Are you telling Dad you're pregnant?" There was a silence. Then she said in a careful voice, "Tessa, I've been telling Mom and Dad for about a month now. We wanted to wait for the gala to make it official to the wider family." I said, "Bryony, I have a daughter. I have had a daughter for 10 months. She said, "I know, sweetie." I said, "Does Dad know?" The pause that followed was the longest pause of my life. She said, "Tessa, Dad has been through a lot this year. The Wilkins deal almost fell apart. His blood pressure has been awful. Mom and we've been protecting him from anything stressful. He doesn't need to be reminded right now that you ran off and started a whole life without us. We thought it was kinder to just let things settle." I said, "Are you telling me he doesn't know I have a baby?" She said, "He knows you had a child." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "He knows, he just hasn't really, engaged with it. And honestly, Tessa, you didn't make it easy. You weren't here. You sent a bunch of cards, but you never came home. He's an old-fashioned man. He needs to be a part of these things in person. I asked her about the photo book I had sent his office. She got quiet again. Then she said the receptionist had given it to her because Dad was traveling and she had been meaning to bring it over, but with everything going on she had just forgotten and it was probably in a drawer somewhere. I said, "Bryony, please tell me you didn't throw out my announcement?" She said she had to go. She said we would talk at the party. I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time after that. Junia had fallen asleep in her high chair, her little fist curled around a half-eaten Cheerio. The dog was watching me, and I thought, in the way you think when something inside you has gone very still and very cold, I thought, no, we are not doing this. I flew to Charleston 4 days before the gala. I told my mother I wanted to come early to help. She was thrilled. She booked me a room at the inn near the country club, the same one where my parents had spent their wedding night 40 years ago, and she told me Bryony would pick me up from the airport. I told her not to bother, that I would rent a car. I needed the freedom. The first thing I did when I landed was drive to my father's office. Delia was still at the front desk. She lit up when she saw me. She said, "My goodness, Tessa, you look just like your mother used to look." She asked if I was here to surprise my dad. I asked her, very gently, if she remembered the photo book I had sent 2 months after my daughter was born, the leather-bound one with the gold lettering. Her face changed. She said yes. She remembered. She said she had set it on his desk personally. She said it had disappeared a few days later, and when she'd asked him about it, he hadn't seemed to know what she was talking about. I asked her, "Does my father know I have a baby?" She looked at me for a long moment, this woman who had bandaged my knee at his office Christmas party when I was 8 years old, and she said, "Honey, he asked me last month if you were ever going to settle down and have a family." I thought it was a joke. I laughed. I went out to my rental car and sat with my hands on the steering wheel for 10 minutes without moving. Then I drove to my sister's house. Bryony lived in a renovated antebellum on a tree-lined street in the historic district. Her housekeeper, a lovely woman named Imelda, recognized me from photos and let me in with a hug. She said Bryony was at a prenatal yoga class. She said I should make myself comfortable. I made myself very comfortable. I started in Bryony's home office, the room she had decorated to look like something out of a Nancy Meyers movie, all white shelves and curated books. I went through her desk drawers. I found expense reports for the gala. I found receipts for a maternity photo shoot. I found, in the bottom drawer, taped to the underside, a small envelope. Inside the envelope were 3 things: the photo book I had sent my father, untouched, the cellophane wrap still on it, the birth announcement I had sent to my parents, cream cardstock, pear blossom watercolor, unopened, and a thumb drive. I took everything. I put them in my bag and I walked out of her house and I drove back to the inn with my hands shaking on the wheel. In my room, I plugged the thumb drive into my laptop. It was a folder of files, dozens of them. Photos I had texted to my mother that had been forwarded to Bryony. The video of Junia's first laugh that I had sent in the family group chat. Screenshots of emails I had written to my father that had been forwarded from my mother's account to my sister's. And in a folder labeled Miscellaneous, I found something that stopped my heart. It was a series of text messages between my mother and my sister, going back almost a year, about me, about how to keep my father from being too involved, about how my mother had been the one to intercept the photo book before Delia could get it to Dad's desk, about how Bryony had told my father, casually, in passing, that I had decided not to send a birth announcement because I was going through a rough patch with the family, about how my mother had agreed it would be better not to push him on it, about how the real first grandchild would be Bryony's baby and how nice that would be for Daddy, who had always wanted a Carolina grandchild, about how the inheritance question would resolve itself naturally if Tessa stayed disconnected. The inheritance question. I sat on the bed in that pretty little inn and I read every single message. I read about how my mother had thrown out the Easter photo. I read about how Bryony had laughed when she saw Junia's 6-month picture, how she had said the baby looked like a potato. I read about how my mother had asked my father, hypothetically, what he would do if one of his daughters had a child out of wedlock and didn't tell him. I read the screenshot of his response in his familiar texting style, all caps and no punctuation. I would cut them out. That's not family, that's an anger. Out of wedlock. They had told him I wasn't married. I called Holden. I told him I wasn't married. I called Holden. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said in that calm voice he uses when he's trying not to break something, he said, "What do you want to do?" I told him I wanted him and Junia to fly out the day of the gala. I told him I wanted them at the country club at exactly 7:30. I told him I needed 3 days to put everything together. He said, "Are you sure?" I said yes. He said, "Okay." The next 2 days I worked. I went to my parents' attorney, an old family friend named Mr. Turney, Penland, and I asked him a hypothetical question about whether a power of attorney could be challenged if the principal had been deceived. He looked at me over his glasses and asked me what was going on. I told him. I showed him the messages. He went very still, and then he asked me to leave it all with him. He said my father needed to see this. He said my father needed to see this immediately. I said no. I said I needed 3 more days. I said I wanted my father to see his granddaughter first. Mr. Penland nodded slowly. He said, "Tessa, I have known your father for 37 years. He is a hard man and a proud man, but he is not the man your sister has been pretending he is." He said, "You do whatever you need to do at that party. I will be there. I will have everything ready." I went to a printer downtown and I made enlargements, big ones, poster board size. The hospital photo of Junia in my arms an hour after she was born, her 1-month photo on a sheepskin rug, her first Christmas, her 6-month sitting up in a pumpkin, a picture of her in pear blossoms taken in our backyard, wearing the same little embroidered dress I had been wearing in a photo my father kept on his desk. I had 3 of them mounted and wrapped in plain brown paper, and I stored them in the trunk of my rental car. I had Holden book a flight. I bought a dress for the gala, a dark green silk thing that I knew my mother would consider too modern. And the morning of the party, I drove out to the country club early, before the staff had finished setting up, and I asked the events coordinator, a woman named Priz, if I could borrow the projector and screen for a 5-minute family slideshow during the speeches. I told her it was a surprise gift from my father. She said of course. I gave her a thumb drive of my own. The gala started at 7. I was there at 6:45. My mother saw me first. She floated over in a beaded ivory gown, kissed both my cheeks, told me I looked thin. She introduced me to people I had known since childhood, as if they had never met me before. "This is my older daughter Tessa," she said. "She lives in Oregon now. She designs buildings." She told the story of my career in a way that made it sound like I had abandoned the family. Bryony arrived at 7 on the dot, glowing in a pale pink gown with a sash across her belly. My father followed her in, his hand at the small of her back, like she was a bride. He saw me. He nodded. He kept walking. He didn't hug me. I want you to know that I felt that. I want you to know that even after everything I had read, even after everything I knew, I felt that nod like a slap. He walked past his older daughter without a hug, on his way to escort his younger one to her seat, and a small voice inside me said, "You could still leave. You could turn around right now. You could walk out and never come back, and the rest of your life would be peaceful." But Junia, my Junia, sleeping right now in a hotel 2 miles away with her father, not knowing yet that her grandfather had been told she didn't exist. No, the dinner went on. I sat at the family table and listened to my mother make small talk. I watched my sister glow. I watched my father, this man I had been afraid of and proud of and desperate to please my entire life, raise his glass at 8:15 for his first toast. He talked about my mother for 10 minutes. He talked about Bryony and her husband for 5. He talked about how they were giving him the greatest gift of his life, the gift of a grandchild, the next generation of the family. He said, "And I'm not going to forget this until the day I die," he said. I had almost given up hope. 40 years of marriage, and I thought maybe this old house would never hear the sound of a baby again. The room awed. People wiped their eyes. My mother dabbed at her face with a napkin. Bryony placed her hand on her stomach and looked up at our father like he was a saint. He turned to me. The whole room was watching. He raised his glass in my direction, this small, reluctant gesture, and he said, "And Tessa, of course, we hope someday it'll be your turn too. Someday soon, sweetheart. Don't make us wait too long." I stood up. I held my own glass. I let the silence stretch. I said into the silence, "Daddy, it was 10 months ago. You were invited." Nobody moved. I said, "Her name is Junia. She's named after Holden's grandmother. Holden is my husband. We've been married for 3 years. You were at the wedding for about 30 seconds in a video Bryony filmed. She didn't show it to you. My mother was on her feet." "Tessa," she hissed, "sit down. Sit down right now." I said, "She was born on a Tuesday morning at 4:19. She weighed 7 pounds, 4 ounces. I sent you a photo book. I sent you a birth announcement. I sent you Christmas cards and Easter cards and 10 months of pictures, and not one of them ever made it to your hands. They were intercepted, every single one of them, by Mom and by Bryony." The whole room had gone silent. Pris, beautiful, brilliant Pris, was already starting the slideshow. The first photo of my daughter appeared on the screen behind my father, 11 feet tall. Junia in the hospital, her tiny hand wrapped around my finger. The room gasped. My father turned around. He saw her. "I will tell you something. I will tell you something I didn't expect." My father, who had not hugged me when I walked in, who had toasted his 40th anniversary while erasing his first grandchild, my father took 2 steps toward that screen, and his knees gave out. He sat down hard in his chair. He put his hand over his mouth. The next photo came up. Junia smiling in her bumblebee pajamas, and he made a sound I have never heard a grown man make in my life. Bryony was already moving. She was trying to get to the projector. She was saying something about a misunderstanding, about how I had always been jealous, about how this wasn't the time. My mother grabbed her arm. The whole room was watching. I said, and this was the part I had practiced. This was the part I had written down in the inn the night before. I said, "Mr. Penland is here tonight. He's been my father's attorney for 37 years. He has copies of every text message Mom and Bryony sent each other for the last 14 months, planning how to keep my daughter a secret. He has bank records showing that Bryony has been moving money out of the trust Granddad set up for both of us, using forged signatures of mine. He has the receipts. He has all of it." I looked at my father. I said, "Dad, Holden is downstairs in the lobby with Junia. She's been waiting all night to meet you, if you want to." My father stood up. He was crying. This man, who I had never seen cry in my life, who had not cried at his own mother's funeral, was openly weeping at his 40th anniversary gala in front of 200 people. He looked at my mother. He looked at Bryony. He looked at the screen, where a photo of Junia in her Halloween costume, a tiny pear with a green leaf hat, was filling the room. He said, "Take me to her." He didn't say another word to my mother or my sister. He walked the entire length of that ballroom with me, in front of every person who mattered in Charleston society, and he didn't look back once. Holden was in the lobby, standing by the fountain, holding our daughter, who was wearing a navy blue velvet dress with white tights. She was awake. She was looking around at the chandeliers with that wide-eyed Junia look, the one where her mouth makes a little O. My father stopped about 10 feet away. He couldn't get closer. He just stood there weeping silently, and then he said, "May I?" Holden walked over and put my daughter into my father's arms. Junia, who is normally suspicious of strangers, who screams when my dentist tries to wave at her, looked up into my father's face and put her tiny hand on his cheek. She said, "Duh." She said it very clearly, "Duh." My father sat down on the edge of the fountain. He held my daughter. He cried, and then he laughed, and then he cried again. And Junia patted his face like she was reassuring an old friend. He looked up at me. He said, "Tessa, I am so sorry. I am so sorry." I said, "I know, Dad. I know." The fallout came fast. Mr. Penland filed the documents the following Monday. The forgery investigation was federal, since some of the trust funds had crossed state lines. Bryony was arraigned 3 weeks later. She lost her seat on the Junior League board, then the Historical Society, then the country club itself. Peirce filed for divorce 6 weeks into the investigation, citing the financial irregularities and what he called a complete loss of trust. She is currently living in my parents' guest house awaiting trial. Her baby was born in March, a healthy boy. My father pays for the medical bills. He has not seen the child. My mother spent 2 months in what she called a wellness retreat in the mountains. When she came back, my father had moved out. He filed for legal separation. He told her, and she told me later, weeping over the phone, that he could forgive her for many things in their marriage, but he could not forgive her for stealing his granddaughter. He moved to Portland in February. He bought a small house 6 blocks from ours. Junia calls him Bumpa, which is what she came up with on her own. He picks her up from daycare 2 days a week. He has missed only one of those pickups in the 8 months since he moved, and that was because he was in the hospital for a hip replacement. And Holden brought Junia to his recovery room with a balloon. I see my mother twice a year. We have lunch. We are polite. She has not met my daughter, and I do not know if she ever will. I am pregnant again, by the way. A boy this time. Due in June. When I told my father, he sat down on our couch and put his face in his hands and cried for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "This time, please. I want to know on the day. I want to be the second person you call." He said, "I missed it once. I am not missing it again." I said, "Dad, you'll be the second call, right after Holden. I promise." He said, "I don't deserve that." I said, "You do now." And we sat on the couch in my living room, with my daughter asleep upstairs and my husband cooking dinner in the kitchen and a baby growing inside me that my father would know about from the very first heartbeat. And I thought, this is what I almost lost. This is what was almost taken from me. And I thought about how close I came to never knowing the truth, to showing up at Christmas one year and finding my sister's son on my father's lap, hearing him called the firstborn, watching my own daughter be erased from a family she never even got to know. I think about that sometimes. I think about it when Junia toddles into the kitchen in the morning and sees her grandfather at the table and runs to him with her arms up. I think about the version of my life where I had stayed quiet, where I had let it happen, where I had told myself the story that my father was just a busy man, and my sister was just a flighty girl, and my mother was just doing her best. I'm so glad I stood up. I'm so glad I drove to Charleston 4 days early. I'm so glad my daughter has a Bumpa who shows up. If you were listening to this and there is someone in your family who has been told a version of you that isn't true, please, don't wait. Don't assume. Don't let other people be the bridge between you and the people you love. Pick up the phone. Get on the plane. Walk into the room. The truth will not deliver itself. Mine almost didn't. I think about that night at the country club more than I should. Not because of the slideshow, or my father's knees giving out, or the silence that fell over 200 people when I said my daughter's name out loud for the first time in that ballroom. I think about the version of me who almost didn't go. The version who almost stayed in Portland that weekend, who almost let the lie become permanent, who almost let my mother and Bryony rewrite my daughter out of our family history, one quiet decision at a time. For 10 months, I had been telling myself a kind story. I told myself my father was just busy. I told myself my mother meant well. I told myself my sister was caught in the middle. I dressed up cowardice as patience and called it being the bigger person. And while I was being the bigger person, my own child was being erased from the only grandfather she would ever have. The thing nobody tells you about being the unfavored daughter is that you spend your whole life waiting for the favoritism to be a misunderstanding. You think if you just achieve enough, move far enough away, stay quiet enough, the people who hurt you will eventually realize what they had. They don't. They don't, because the favoritism wasn't about you in the first place. It was about them. It was about my mother needing a daughter who would never leave the orbit of her approval, and Bryony being willing to play that role for a piece of an inheritance that was never hers alone to begin with. I had to learn, late and painfully, that protecting yourself isn't the same as protecting your peace. Real peace requires courage. Real peace requires the moment when you stand up at a long table in front of 200 people and say the true thing out loud, even when your voice shakes, Even when your mother hisses at you to sit down, even when every cell in your body remembers being the quiet daughter who never made a scene. I wasn't quiet that night. And the world did not end. My family ended, the false version of it, the painted-over version that had me posing for Christmas cards next to people who were stealing from me. But something truer was waiting underneath. A father who carried my daughter to the fountain and wept. A husband who flew across the country with our baby in a velvet dress and never asked why I needed him there. A grandfather who picks Junia up from daycare twice a week now and has not been late once. If you take anything from my story, take this. The people who love you will not let other people speak for you. If someone in your life keeps insisting on being the bridge between you and the people you love, ask yourself why. Bridges are for crossing. The ones who build them and then guard the gate are not protecting anyone but themselves. Walk around them, pick up the phone, drive to the office, show up at the door with the baby in your arms. Let them see what they were told didn't exist. I almost waited too long. Don't.